Thanks very much, Don, and certainly 2011, those dark days. It's wonderful to be standing up here looking at an industry that is prospering and thriving. There was probably times in 2011 when you could have been thinking that you'd be talking to an empty room. So let's hope that in the next 11 years, if those who will be standing here again in 11 years' time will also be looking at a larger crowd, an industry that's continuing to thrive. I just want to acknowledge a lot of the people in the room here, people that have put their lives and their careers and their businesses on the line for the live export trade and who have been so instrumental in being able to allow this trade to continue to thrive. It's certainly been through some challenging times, and I think that some of those discussions this morning highlighted the fact that there's plenty more work to do yet. I'm going to be fairly blunt, and I want to also recognise the work of the Commonwealth and also Beth's talk, which I think is very important, placing some context around some of our threat assessment. I've also got a lot of people from the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Biosecurity in the room as well. What I'll do is I'll just get them to quickly stand up from our biosecurity livestock production team and our Chief Vet and Deputy Chief Vet down the front here, and Phil Horsley, who's coming up onto the stage a bit later on to make a book launch. These are the people that you can please catch up with around in the stand if you need to ask those critical questions, because you'll see why those questions are going to be important when we're talking about biosecurity response. Now, I'm really going to just talk very briefly about, in case any of you have been napping, and Beth should have got you thinking about it, but these are beautiful warm scenes. They're lovely serene scenes that we're all used to. They can change very quickly, and I think we've all seen these images being used to get people's attention as to what biosecurity an outbreak could mean for the country. We've seen what happened in the UK. Beth talked about what happened in the UK, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But I think we have probably been living in a period of time over the last 150 years where we haven't had a major animal disease outbreak. We've had a lot of other things happen probably in the plant and pest area, but major animal disease outbreaks have been fairly limited. So we've been reasonably shielded from it. But what we know, of course, is that the industries and everything that sits behind our livestock sector are critical. And why? Because it's been talked about already, because we are a trading nation. Our ability to trade is fundamental to our prosperity. The people in this room rely upon our ability to trade both ways, admittedly, but certainly trading outwards. And what we know is that a major disease outbreak means that that stops, and we know what that effect is. So we also know that if we have a major disease outbreak, this is not an animal problem. It starts as an animal problem. It quickly becomes an emergency which involves people, and it expands to being a community problem very, very quickly. Beth talked about the capacity of the existing agriculture departments and others to deal with emergency response is quickly extinguished, or it quickly runs out. Historically, what we know is that agriculture departments and industry have been seen through these national deeds that are in place. These cost-sharing deeds and response deeds have had the framework there to deal with a major animal emergency, and it's been seen that that would be done within those traditional agricultural agencies. What the UK showed us was that that is not the case. Within hours, those agencies run out of room, they run out of steam, they run out of people, they run out of capacity. And what has to happen is that the broader emergency management environment has to kick in. And that's what's, fortunately, I think has been starting to happen through the National Task Force, is bringing the awareness around a major animal disease outbreak into the consciousness of emergency management more generally, not just within agriculture departments and industry, which has been dealing with the preparation and planning for that for a number of years. So we know that we have to expand immediately. That's been happening at the jurisdictional level. We've had those discussions with our emergency agencies, and that's been happening at the national level. But to be effective, we have to do that between us, because the rule will be, if something goes down, it'll be Rule 308. Now, our Chief Veterinary Officer is here. If you want to talk about what the implications are if we were unfortunate enough to have an outbreak in this country, what that would mean for us as to how we would respond, Sue Fitzpatrick will, I think, be able to tell you how we would respond in the Northern Territory, how we'd expect others to respond in the rest of the country and nationally, between all our chief veterinary officers around the country, how would we respond. And the plans are in place, the AusVet plans which Beth referred to are in place, and they detail how we would respond. And yes, Rule 308 applies. Number one, it's about stamping out and doing it as quickly and as rapidly and effectively as humanly possible within the resources that we have. The fact that we've only got 200,000 308 rounds in the country right now is a bit of a problem. Anyway, that's another issue. And how the jurisdictions work together, how the borders are managed, how the chief veterinary officers work across the country and how we work nationally in order to put in a stock standstill, for example, and how quickly that happens is critical. Because what we know is that the movement of livestock is very rapid, and before you know it, if detection is done too slowly, if that diagnosis is too slow, is that things have moved a long way before we realise. The UK example was, I think, 5 days between when the infection was thought to start, this is foot and mouth disease, and when they discovered it when some pigs went into an abattoir. By then, it had gone everywhere, or it had spread rapidly. So the effectiveness of how that system operates, and there's no lines off to Indonesia or to Vietnam or to the Middle East in relation to the animals that might be in a ship on a boat. This is just some internal, and that's hypothetical. This hasn't happened, and hopefully it never will. That's hypothetical. So the success in our capacity to respond to an emergency is a function of the speed of discovery and diagnosis. The decisions that will lead to those immediate actions which see the stamping out process take place as fast and as rapidly and as a coordinated way as possible in order to get on top of it, because every part of this has to have a view to recovery. If we go back to the Major General's address this morning, we have to have a reason for doing this. The reason is recovery, because we have to trade. Our livelihoods depend on it. And it needs to be coordinated at the national level, it needs to be coordinated at the local level, and it needs to be part of the emergency management framework this country has for a whole range of things, but it needs to be brought into the mainstream. The emergency animal disease management framework has to be in the mainstream. And recovery, from day one, recovery is paramount at the front of the whole thinking and process, because at the end of the day, it's how fast you can return to the market is critical. So now Beth talked about likelihood, and I'm going to touch on this. This is the 4 major animal diseases that have been part of this national sort of risk threat assessment. 2 of those diseases are vector-borne diseases. In the case of African horse sickness and lumpy skin, they're vector-borne diseases transferred by insects. African swine fever and foot and mouth disease aren't vector-borne. There's been a lot of talk about lumpy skin disease, and I'm going to probably focus mainly on that, because regardless of the probability, there's experts that have said there's a probability range between 4 and 56% for lumpy skin. That's a pretty big range. So those guys are out at 56%. Well, that's 1 in every 2 years. That's pretty ordinary sort of probability, given that our trade is completely dependent on being free of lumpy skin disease. So clearly there's quite a bit of divergence there. We're of the view that we should be thinking about lumpy skin as being somewhat inevitable in our planning and our preparation. And that's probably the safest place to start. Rather than saying, oh yeah, well look, we probably played that down a little bit and it actually happened and look what's happened now. We think it's probably smart to think about it as being much more certain than uncertain at the moment, because we know that our pathways into the country are through the north for a lot of these vector-borne diseases. We've had fall armyworm, we've had Japanese encephalitis, we've had African serpentine leaf miner, we've had E. canis, the list goes on. We have blue tongue and various other diseases that travel backwards and forwards on the wind, with vectors that are viable vectors for transferring disease. And that little fella up on the top right of the screen is a Kilcoides, which is a very small thing. I don't know, it's not microscopic, but it's bloody tiny. And that is one of the vectors that moves blue tongue around in our region. There's 300 plus species of those things. They move blue tongue around. We know through the research that's been done by CSIRO and by the Berrima Veterinary Laboratory that we have blue tongue, part of the arbovirus monitoring program, moving into the north, and new species coming in most years, and these little guys are moving it. We know that. It's been shown to be the case. That particular picture there is around Beatrice Hill, which is one of the research farms on the floodplain where a lot of this arbovirus monitoring, or one of a number of sites that are used for monitoring arbovirus or blue tongue. So we know that the potential is there. What we don't know is what the potential for some of these vectors are to transfer lumpy skin and how viable that is. And picking up on Beth's point, a lot of discussion around how many you need, you know, mechanical vectors, which is basically carrying it in your bag or on your shoes as you come in, versus carrying it inside your body as an infected insect, as opposed to carrying a bit of dirt on your boots, putting it simply. But we've got a lot more questions we need to ask in order to validate that, I guess, that probability equation, and to be very cautious about not playing it down. So, can these vectors carry lumpy skin into the north? That's the question. Some people would say yes, they certainly have the potential to. The Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness in Geelong, which is that big building up there on the top right-hand side, is our highest security laboratory in the country. That now has lumpy skin in there, which is being used for doing a lot of research, which is critical to our preparedness. And we've got people in Southeast Asia looking at over 300 species of Kilcoides in relation to how viable, what species of Kilcoides may be able to be viable vectors for moving lumpy skin around. And there's the issue about biological transmission versus just mechanical transmission. So what that means is I carry the disease on my boots as I come in versus I am infected with it inside my body and I transfer it through biting or something like that. That's the question. So I'm not answering a lot of questions, I'm probably asking more, and I think we have to ask more questions and we have to work collectively together to deal with them. And this is part of the story about our region. And it's about the blow-ins, because that's some of what we're talking about. We're not talking about the ones that walk in, and admitting that a lot of livestock movements certainly are based on animals moving and taking it with them, but we also know that blow-ins work. We've got ample examples right now of a whole heap of pests that keep blowing in every year, and some of them are now endemic through the country. So I guess we know these pathways. Beth spoke very eloquently about how rapid some of these pathways have developed and taken everybody by surprise. Lumpy skin was some theoretical thing you learned about in uni a few years ago. Now it's just gone like light speed through our region, and it's now on our doorstep. And so the critical thing is, how much do we know about our region? How much of the success of our biosecurity preparedness is about the success of Indonesia and of Timor to battle with their own challenges? And how can we help Indonesia be a success and Timor to be a success? And there's a lot of work going on in that space, clearly. And you know, I've got to acknowledge that it's wonderful to be here in Australia and talk about these terrible things, but Indonesians are going through absolute hell. It's transforming some of the livestock ownership systems and businesses as we speak. It's upending the place, and it's tragic. So we need to certainly know about our region and what's going on. We need to do more to engage. We need to understand the routes and the way things are operating, and we need to be involved in it. But we also need to be thinking about our pre-incursion preparedness. So if we are talking about blow-ins, well, what happens when they do blow in? Now, it may be you need X number of these things and multiple species to bite the one animal in order to start the disease moving. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you need just one. But what should we be doing to model and to prepare should they blow in? Should things blow into the north of Australia? Because it doesn't matter if an animal gets lumpy skin in Katherine. People in Tasmania will not be selling milk. They will not be selling beef, full stop. So it doesn't matter. It's all our problem. It's not a northern problem. It's all our problem. If we are as unfortunate enough to get something like this occur, it's all our problem. And our eyes and ears and our reconnaissance and intelligence, our defence in depth, to use a military term, I'm not sure whether the Major General's still here or not, I can't see him, but is really important. How do we extend our capacity to defend in depth into our region? and help the success of our neighbours in doing that. And how do we build greater relationships between people? We've talked a lot about relationships this morning, business relationships, government relationships, people-to-people links. How do we do as much of that as possible so we build the base for a better understanding, better intelligence, and better forewarning? How do we work together? And these are active programs that are working today between organisations that are here in the room, on ground in Indonesia, helping smallholder farmers, helping get the messages out, helping lift capability and capacity. Eudes, where are you, Eudes? There he is. Now, I'm going to get you up on the stage later, not just right now, but I don't want people to get traumatised, but Eudes was part of a program in 2012, or that started in 2012, run by the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association, has over 150 alumni now. There's 2 of them here today, who are part of a program to develop long-term relationships between Indonesia and the Northern Territory. This year, a small program was developed by the Northern Territory government to build on exactly the same model for biosecurity. That was probably the previous one of those previous slides there. This is about building partnerships. They're not going to change anything overnight, but these things are really important. They're long-term and they're really critical. But the point about this is that these sorts of things have a capacity to influence and to inform, and they're really important. So Eudes is going to come up a little bit later on with some of his colleagues onto the stage. So, I've lost my train of thought there. Former Prime Minister of not the Northern Territory, sorry, of Australia. So if we're talking about our people, which is a critical determinant of our capacity to respond, we talk about peacetime and we talk about wartime. Well, that's one way of thinking about it. We're in a peacetime environment now. It's the time to prepare. It's the time to do our homework. In the north, and I'm going to refer to this as the northern audience because in the north, our pathways into the country for a lot of these potential diseases, we have a low population. We know all the statistics. There's the information there, vast areas. All those challenges that we know, which are things which will inhibit our capacity to identify, diagnose and respond quickly. It's that days matter, hours matter, and that is going to determine our success as a nation, but it also is in Northern Australia. And how we train our people, the people we have available to do the on-ground work. The Northern Network, which Beth announced and also the Minister announced, is a critical piece of infrastructure which is helping us build the capacity in Northern Australia to be effective on the ground. And at the end of the day, it depends how all this works together. I'm really sorry, hope there's nobody from Tasmania here. And the reason I talk about Tasmania is I started going to school in the 60s and into the 70s. And the government used to give us these little plastic maps of Australia, and you used to trace around them with your pencil, and it even had the dotted lines for the, Western Australia, Northern Territory, and all that sort of stuff. And you dot these dotted lines. But there's no Tasmania on that map. I don't know how they did it back in those days, but there's no Tasmania. There wasn't even a cutout bit in the inside where you'd slide it down and do it. There was no Tasmania on that little plastic map the government used to give us in our schools. Anyways, but apologies, I just couldn't fit Tassie on there. But this is as relevant to Tasmania as it is to anybody else. It doesn't really matter. But how effectively they work together, those chief veterinary officers in each jurisdiction, how they manage a national stock standstill, how the decisions are made to shut down movements of livestock in order to find out where livestock have gone and to stamp out Rule 303, 308, that's going back to Breaker Morant, I'm sorry, Rule 308, how that's enacted, putting it mildly. So this Northern Network is very important and acknowledge the investment from the Commonwealth Government in that. And what we have to hang off on the bottom of that is a comprehensive industry liaison network, which is in the process of being stood up in various forms through industry groups, industry bodies, but we have to have competently trained people who are in the industry, in the supply chains, who know what to do when the war starts, and they also know what to do in preparation and prior to the war starting. Hopefully we'll never have a war, but we have to prepare for it, and being prepared is important. Very quickly, I'm going to finish on something. Now I'm not trying to hypnotise anybody, but I'm going to finish on this because this is something about our systems. Earlier on I mentioned it is critical how quickly we identify and trace and track livestock. Our ability to do that quickly and effectively is going to be a determinant of how quickly we recover. So hopefully this will work. Now this was from 2017. These are livestock movements. You can see the date up there, 29th of July, August, going through. You probably get the idea. Funny thing is, on Christmas Day, not much goes on. It was really interesting if you wait that long. Got 5 minutes to go. But anyway, we don't need to watch the whole thing, but the point is, when you look at some of these models, livestock move incredibly rapidly. And within 2 or 3 days, you can have livestock on different parts of the country. Identifying where those livestock have come from, if there's a disease outbreak in a certain location, where they've gone, and doing that very accurately is absolutely critical. So I'll go on to the next thing. So I'll probably finish with this, the point that our national systems are critical to our ability to do this. And an EAD response, an emergency animal disease response, its effectiveness will be determined by our ability to track and trace efficiently and effectively. The NLIS system is a critical piece of Australia's infrastructure. Is it fit for purpose? Is it going to work when the war starts? We have little skirmishes that break out from time to time. We have to try and track animals for various diseases. Anthrax, there were some cases in Victoria recently. It was a nightmare trying to track sheep who had gone in all different directions. Mob transfers, mob movements, all this sort of stuff, it's a nightmare. Every person that is down trying to find an animal somewhere that's disappeared into the system is a person who could be out doing on-ground emergency stamping out or something else like that. They're not wasting their time shuffling pieces of paper and trying to track animals relentlessly. We need a system that works effectively, a nationally consistent system. It's fit for purpose with a database that's going to work because our future depends on it. I was just going to say that, yeah, so now I'll touch on it on the next slide, I think. So the Commonwealth's put some money towards this, and it's an opportunity. I think these opportunities don't always come through at the same time. It's an opportunity that we shouldn't pass up. So it's been talked about as being about sheep and goats. Federal ministers, state ministers have agreed to it, that we're going to put this in place. What it looks like, what it'll be like, we don't know, but the principle about traceability for sheep and goats has been agreed to. We have an existing system for cattle, which is very good, but it's not perfect. How do we use this opportunity to say, let's make this about multiple species, let's do it really well with a future in mind, and make sure it's an effective system that will allow us to find things when we need to find them and do it really, really quickly. Because our trade, our livelihoods, and our national systems depend on it. So that's probably as far as I need to go. Any quick questions? Question down the front, yeah.
It's David Gardner. The question is, what's the timeline on the expected amalgamation?
Sorry, oh there you are,
Yeah,
sorry. I was looking here.
What's the expected time to amalgamate the two NLI structures?
Don't know.
Well, I think that's one of the issues that everyone's worried about, that it's been dragging for probably 4 or 5 years now, and the database is totally inadequate.
I don't have any solutions. I've simply asked the question. I'm sorry. Jason Strong is going to be here shortly, today and tomorrow, so that will be a question for Jason Strong.
Luke, Terry Sim from Sheep Central. The only published draft timeline for the sheep-goat EID system in New South Wales, that's the only one that's been published as a draft, only at this stage, won't put that state in a position where it could be compared to the National Traceability Performance Standards until at least 2028. Is that time frame? What do you think of that time?
I don't know what people in the room think. It doesn't sound great to me, but it doesn't sound fantastic.
Do you think it needs to happen sooner?
Yes. Our Chief Veterinary Officer might want to comment. Do you want to comment, do you, Sue? Dr. Sue Fitzpatrick, Chief Veterinary Officer, she might have a view on this.
Given the Territory doesn't actually have a sheep industry, it is hard to comment. but there is the draft 1st of January 2025. I think what Luke was outlining is this is an opportunity for multiple species to look for reform. So one thing might be commitment to having a traceability system for EID for sheep and goats for 1st of January 2025, but it is also an opportunity to look across species, and there could be a better system. So not just adopting the EID for sheep and goats.
Okay, now what's the story? I need to wind up. Yep. So we've got a quick announcement to make. I'm going to ask Phil Horsler, who is the Senior Executive Director of Agriculture in the Northern Territory Government, to come up to the stage. And I'm going to hand over to Phil because Phil's going to talk about a book that we've just released.
Thanks, Luke.
Over to you, Phil.
One of our long-term staff members retired earlier this year, David Folkes. Have we got a slide?
Oh, sorry, Phil. Yep, there we go.
So there's a photo of David and the book. But I just wanted to acknowledge David's efforts over his 35-year career with the Northern Territory Government. He commenced with us in January 1987 and has been a very valued member of the livestock industries branch. David's provided the department with a wealth of knowledge over that 35 years, providing training, resources, advice, technical publications and reports on commercial cattle in Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. He's previously been involved with buffalo nutrition research, provided extension services to the Asian Lynx program, and was instrumental in the establishment of the Vietnamese live export market. Earlier this year, David tendered his resignation to retire and finished up with us in June 2022. In the lead up to his retirement, David put in a huge effort to write up all of his work and present it in this manual. It's titled Tropical Beef Production and Husbandry of Australian Cattle and Buffalo in Southeast Asia. It is an amazing resource. We've got on our stand, we've got a QR code with a link. You can download a digital copy of this. And I'd also like to ask Luke to help me hand out 3 free copies to someone in the audience.
Okay.
So just really want to acknowledge the work of David Folkes and his career with us in the department and his commitment to write up all of his work.
It's an incredibly dense piece of work. When I say dense, it is packed. It is data rich. So anyway, that's all I'll say about it. It's